Welcome to this video on recommendations for reviewing qualitative research. I'm Heidi Lellitt from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and I'm so pleased to have been invited to talk with you today about qualitative methods. It's exciting to see the growth of interest in qualitative methods in our field and the increasing diversity of methods being used today. In this video, there will be three goals of presentation. The first will be assessing and communicating your scope of expertise. Next, understanding methodological integrity, and finally, examining and evaluating a qualitative manuscript. Before focusing upon these goals, I wanted to make clear that the term qualitative research really refers to a set of methods that are based in multiple approaches to inquiry. And in this video, when I refer to approaches to inquiry, I'm referring to philosophical assumptions that are variously referred to in the literature as paradigms or worldviews or epistemologies, and these are associated with distinct goals and ways of viewing and languaging research. Goals may include developing attuned hypotheses, developing theories or descriptions or understandings, understanding the development of social constructs, responding to societal injustices, illuminating discursive practices, among many other goals. And so you may find that there's a need to translate the terms that I use into your own preferred method or into the method that's being used in the paper you're reviewing. So when I refer to data collection, I'm referring to things like data selection, data co-construction, fieldwork, etc. When I talk about analysis, that could mean coding, categorizing, reflection, etc. The language that I use may seem embedded in an unfamiliar philosophical approach or an approach that's different from the paper you're reviewing. And when reviewing qualitative manuscripts, you may need to familiarize yourself with new terminology and engage in this very sort of translation. The presentation is going to be influenced by my experience as an editor, researcher, and reviewer, and is also centrally informed by the work of two task forces that I've had the great pleasure to chair. The first task force was set by the Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology, which is a section of Division 5, and was formed to develop recommendations for designing and reviewing qualitative research. This had a specific focus on looking across qualitative methods and thinking about how to adapt procedures for use in particular studies. The second task force was a task force by the American Psychological Association, and its focus was to develop recommendations for reporting standards for the 7th edition of the Publication Manual of the American Psychological Association. And a link to direct viewers to the information within these reports will be found on the webpage where this video is posted. Moving into our first goal, assessing and communicating your scope of expertise. With an APA accreditation for doctoral programs currently, qualitative methods are not a required part of our training at present. This means that when editors have a manuscript that they're setting out for review, they may be very unfamiliar with the background that a reviewer has in qualitative methods. Do they have education in qualitative methods? Are they familiar with this approach? And this means that the assessment on your competency for review really falls to you as a reviewer. To provide a competent, complete review, a reviewer should have a depth of understanding in the topic being studied, the specific method in use, and also how to appropriately adapt qualitative methods to specific projects. If you don't have experience in using and adapting qualitative methods or the method in use, you could check with the editor on the assignment. But in any case, you should make clear the basis of your expertise in your review so editors can consider how to weigh your remark. So, for instance, if I was conducting a review of a phenomenological paper, I might make clear that although I'm quite familiar with phenomenological theory, that I don't consider myself a phenomenologist. And I would hope that the editor then could weigh my remarks appropriately in relation to other reviewers who might have more expertise using that method than I do. Moving to our second goal, an orientation to methodological integrity. Qualitative researchers have long sought language to describe rigor within their approaches. Trustworthiness is a term used to signal the worth of a study based on the judgments of how convincing a research presentation is to its readers. Methodological integrity is a concept that's been advanced as the underlying methodological basis of trustworthiness. So this means the assessment of trustworthiness that's independent of non-method qualities, such as a reader's prior affiliation with a theory or the narrative flow of a presentation. Methodological integrity can be evaluated via two composite processes. First, seeking fidelity to the subject matter, which is the process by which researchers use procedures so that their study findings will hold allegiance to the phenomenon in question. And it's important to understand that fidelity should be understood within the approach to inquiry and use. So, for instance, if I'm reviewing a manuscript by a social constructionist, I would look to see if the construct that's being presented is made clear in keeping with that tradition. So do I understand from the manuscript how this concept was constructed, how this construction was maintained within a community? Seeking utility of contributions is the process by which researchers select procedures that can generate insightful findings to usefully answer their research questions. Both of these processes together form the basis of methodological integrity. There are important distinctions between fidelity and utility. So you could have a manuscript that you find to be very high in fidelity but lacking in utility. So for instance, I might be reading a paper and find that I'm getting a very clear sense, very vivid understanding of the phenomenon it's portraying, but I'm confused about how the findings lead to a furthering of the literature or help to solve the problem that's being considered. In contrast, I might have a paper that's high in utility but seems to be lacking in fidelity. So you could have a manuscript that seems to be presenting new ideas that seem like they might solve problems and appear to be new contributions, but you're not convinced that they seem to be grounded in the data. I'm not convinced that they really represent the construct as it exists in the world or as it exists in the texts or media being examined. An evaluation of methodological integrity considers whether the implementation of fidelity and utility function well together, and importantly, whether they function coherently in relation to the researcher's goals, their approaches to inquiry, so again, their philosophical assumptions, epistemologies, worldviews, and study characteristics, so the particular subject matter under study, the participants, researchers, resources. Moving into examining and evaluating a qualitative manuscript, this presentation will focus on common issues that cross many qualitative methods and is organized to highlight the appraisal of methodological integrity, which is a construct formed to consider common issues across methods. It wouldn't be possible to review all the qualitative methods within a 30-minute video and address the unique aspects of each in evaluating a manuscript. But it's important to note that there are other assessments that also would be good for you as a reviewer to employ as well. I would ask myself as a reviewer, is the study I'm looking at enacting the method that it claims to be using? I'd also ask myself, is the study consistent with the tradition or approach to inquiry that it claims? Also, there are considerations that might be outside of the paper's content, such as the journal audience. I might ask myself as a reviewer, would readers of this journal find this paper to be useful and relevant? There are 5 general characteristics of qualitative reporting that I wanted to address. You might find as a reviewer that the method and results descriptions tend to be longer than in quantitative papers. And this is because qualitative authors are often adapting original methods or combining procedures to answer certain questions. And there are many different legitimate variants of many qualitative methods to analysis. There are different variants of grounded theory or phenomenologist or content analysis, etc. And often this description is directed to audiences who are less familiar with qualitative methods, and so they require a more detailed level of description. In addition, in the results section, qualitative researchers are writing within a rhetoric of demonstration, which means that they're required to use demonstrations of their analytic process and typically provide quotes and excerpts to make evident the fidelity of their analysis. And this also will lengthen the manuscript. A second general characteristic. qualitative researchers tend to employ an ethic of transparency, and this means that the methods tend to emphasize the personal experience of the researchers coming to the paper, and they tend to utilize a reflexive first-person style to demonstrate the development of the findings in relation to the researcher's expectations. Often, manuscripts will include sections that describe not only the participants or the data sources, but that also describe the investigators and the relationships between the investigators and the participants. A third general characteristic. Qualitative methods tend to aim for contextualized understandings rather than universal findings. Because analyses tend to be based upon processes of description and interpretation, and because the methods tend to study phenomena that are evolving and historically bound, researchers do not expect to have duplication of findings and replication, but to produce findings that would result in a similar degree of methodological integrity. Also, these methods may favor representing the research process narratively over standardized, demarcated sections. Because qualitative methods often evolve as results are being collected, there may be a cyclical process in which researchers collect data, change their methods, adapt their questions, and their result sections and their method sections may seem a little bit more intertwined. Similarly, their discussions and their results sections may seem a little bit more intertwined because their results may necessarily have to have broad implications to be seen as credible results, depending on the method being used. And finally, authors can develop their own methods and may or may not specify a pre-existing method or approach to inquiry. Authors may combine different procedures to tailor the method to a specific problem, and this can be a strength in their approach. They may also use pragmatic problem-solving orientations to address questions instead of listing approach to inquiry, a certain paradigm or epistemology, and this can also be fine. If a method or approach to inquiry is specified, however, as a reviewer, you should be familiar with that approach and that method and be able to identify if authors have followed the key features of that approach or method, or if they've provided a rationale for adaptation. Now we'll move to examine the elements of fidelity within a manuscript. And before I look at each within the context of a manuscript more closely, I'll review the four central elements here. Adequacy. Is the data adequate for the purposes of the study? Perspective management and data collection. How did the researchers manage their own perspectives during data collection? Perspective management and data analysis. How did the researchers manage their perspectives during the data analysis? Groundedness. Are the analyses and findings demonstrated and supported by examples? Focusing on adequacy, as a reviewer, I would look first at the title and ask myself, does this title seem to adequately represent the subject matter of the manuscript? It doesn't need to describe or label the study as a qualitative study in the same way that quantitative studies don't typically label themselves as quantitative studies, but it needs to adequately convey the subject that's being examined and the central concerns. I would also look at the participant section. I would ask myself, do the participants, researchers, and relationships between the researchers and participants aid or hinder the adequacy of the data? So for example, if I was looking at research on psychotherapists, I might look to see, do the participants seem to have diversity in psychotherapy orientation, which could be an important type of diversity for that topic. If I was looking at a research project on Latino immigrants, I might look to see how the researchers represented people from different areas and regions of the United States. Data collection. I look to see if the data collection appears to be adequate for the study goals. When considering data collection, I would ask myself, is the collection adequate for the study goals? And it's important to note that in qualitative analysis, there's not a minimum N that determines adequacy. So I could be looking at a case study of one participant, but that description could be very vivid and provides new insights into that phenomenon in a way that would be very useful in moving the field forward. What I would be asking myself, though, is if the data captures types of diversity that hold sway over this question with respect to the study goals. Also, I keep in mind that sometimes the diversity is determined through the analytic process, as in theoretical sampling. So researchers might be gathering data and then analyzing it and looking within their analytic process, within their findings that are evolving, to determine the types of diversity that they want to recruit as they continue recruitment. Perspective management in data collection. Throughout the paper, and especially in the methods section, I'd be asking myself whether the researchers appear to be aware of their own perspectives. I'd be wondering, have they limited their influence in the data collection? And there are many different methods researchers might use to structure that process of considering their perspectives, such as diaries, memoing, bracketing. And these processes help researchers to think about their opinions, their thoughts as they're coming into a study, and the potential influence they might have in the collection and analytic process. Researchers might make note of having asked open-ended questions, non-leading questions, again, trying to maintain fidelity in the data collection process. However, researchers can use their perspectives to shape their questions or direct the focus of their inquiry. So as a researcher, I might deliberately try to select contexts in which the issue I'm studying is most pertinent or relevant, and that would act to increase the fidelity and utility of my study. But the collection of data is focused within the scope of the question, and it should be attempting to preserve the character of the data as it's being gathered from the participants or from the text or media being examined. Perspective management in data analysis is slightly different. So researchers may be trying to limit their influence on the analysis in a similar way as that we've discussed previously when discussing data collection, or they might be overtly using their perspectives to structure their analytic process. So for example, as a feminist researcher, I might use my understanding of sexism to identify how it appears within written narratives of women in the 1940s. Even if the women did not label their dynamics as sexist, I can bring my analytic lens and shed light on mechanisms of sexism within their written descriptions. And whether I'm working to limit my influence or using my influence to overtly structure my analysis, making clear how I'm moving, how I'm working as an analyst in the manuscript, both ways will enhance fidelity because they make more transparent the position of the researcher when framing the question and analyzing the data. When considering groundedness, I would be looking within the method section to examine if the researchers have described the method clearly in a step-by-step manner so the readers can understand how the findings are grounded in the data. And so it wouldn't be sufficient for a paper to say this paper uses a qualitative analysis, period, or a phenomenological analysis, period. But I'd want to see how the data was collected. How was it transformed? Was it recorded? Were there field notes? I'd want to see a description of the segmenting of text or interviews into units, if that occurred. I'd want a description of the process of arriving at an analytic scheme. Did that scheme emerge from the analysis, or was there a scheme that was developed beforehand that was brought to the analysis? And I'd look closely at the results section to see if there's a description of how the analysis was conducted in a very detailed manner, typically using quotes and excerpts to demonstrate how the findings evolved from those quotes and excerpts. I'd want to feel very confident that the findings were developed from those data. Moving on to consider elements of utility. So first I'll review the 4 basic elements before looking more closely at each in turn. Contextualization. Are the data contextualized and limits made clear? Catalyst for insight. Is the data able to lead to insights that are relevant to the project goal when using the method? Coherence. Are these meanings in the findings presented coherently together? Meaning contributions. Are the findings useful contributions towards the goal of the project? So looking more closely at contextualization, as a reviewer, I'd begin looking at the data collection description. I want to see that the researchers have described the time and place that recruitment occurred or that data sources were created or collected. If there was an archive, I'd want the archive mentioned. I'd look at the results section. Are excerpted or quoted data contextualized so readers can understand their meanings and might be able to transfer them to other contexts more easily? Discussion. I'd look to see if the context of the implications and their limitations are made clear so that people reading this manuscript can understand how to use them across different populations or contexts or questions. Considering whether the study is a catalyst for insight. I'd begin by looking at the data collection. I'd ask myself as a reviewer, does the description of the data collection suggest that insightful contributions are possible from this data? Do they promise a depth and a scope? So if the data consists of one-line answers, I might have questions about how useful and how rich those understandings could be. If the study's focusing on an experience that is a lifelong experience and they've interviewed only novices, I might have questions again. So really looking to see in relationship to the question being posed, what is the source of the data and would this promise insightful findings? I'd also look at the findings. I'd ask myself if they seem to lead readers to a new insight, a new understanding. I kind of want to feel excited when I'm reading a results section and feel like I'm learning something new or seeing a topic through a new perspective. And I look at the discussion. Does the discussion draw out the implications of new insights? Does it make clear how those insights are useful? I'm typically focused on the results section and looking to see if the meanings of the findings are presented so that they're coherent with one another, or if there are discrepancies, are they addressed? So, for instance, if I was reading a paper on finding that some clients found therapist confrontations to be useful, and some clients found therapist confrontations to be disturbing or upsetting, as a reader, that wouldn't really help me. I wouldn't really know how to use that. I'd want to see as a reviewer that the researcher took those findings and helped the reader make sense of them. So potentially saying which type of clients like confrontation, or in which types of relationships does confrontation work, or within which types of problems does it seem to be helpful. This work to make the findings coherent will be very useful for me in applying and understanding these methods and in making clinical decisions. Considering meaning contributions, I'd look to see, is this paper meaningful, and is it making a contribution to the literature that will be helpful? I'd look in the title and abstract. Is it easy for researchers to locate the manuscript and understand its focus so the paper can make a contribution at all? In the introduction, does the literature review make clear why the question under exploration is likely to generate a meaningful contribution? I'd also look at the objectives. If relevant, has the author described how their approach to inquiry frames the goals of the paper so the meaning contribution can be evaluated? So for instance, if I'm reading a paper from a critical lens or a participatory lens, understanding what the goals of those approaches are will be important for me to evaluate whether they've made an important meaning contribution. And I look at the discussion. Does it make clear how the study makes a meaningful contribution to the literature in relationship to the debates and issues that were reviewed in the introduction? Many qualitative researchers will use supplemental checks on methodological integrity, but the central and primary form of methodological integrity is found in the basic analysis, in the analytic process. Still, these checks can help to strengthen the fidelity and the utility of the analysis. And examples of checks can include triangulation, for example, evaluating findings across multiple sources of information or studies, checks on the interview thoroughness or interviewer demands. So sometimes researchers might ask participants to comment on the interview thoroughness or to provide feedback on an interview transcript. Researchers may use consensus or auditing processes to demonstrate that people from different perspectives can see how this set of data might lead to these findings. Member checks or participant findings can be used. Participants may be asked to comment on findings, which can help researchers either fine-tune their results or can confirm their findings. And seeking disconfirming evidence of evolving findings can be used strategically. Also, researchers might use methods to structure research reflexivity, we discussed previously, such as diaries, memos, memoing. And they may check on the utility of the findings in relationship to the study goal. So if the study was meant to have an impact in a certain system, they may evaluate, was that impact successful? In evaluating these checks on integrity, I would ask myself as a reviewer, do the checks seem to increase my understanding of the phenomenon? Do they enhance and enrich my understanding? Do they have fidelity? Do these checks seem to make the findings easier to use across different contexts and with people of different perspectives and experiences or issues? Do they have utility? And I'd ask myself if these checks make sense given the research goals, approach to inquiry, and study characteristics. Is there methodological integrity in this paper? Although we've been focusing on qualitative methods on whole in this paper and on evaluation of qualitative papers, I wanted to alert viewers that the APA reporting standards also include guidelines for reporting qualitative meta-analyses and mixed methods. And in conclusion, the recommendations of this video are to maintain clear communication about your expertise, to consult resources is helpful in understanding the paper you're reviewing. Might mean consulting methods papers to learn about the approach being used or approach to inquiry, consulting reporting standards or design and review recommendations. And throughout the review, to ask yourself if the elements of the research design and presentation permitted a clear understanding of the phenomenon, did it have fidelity? If they permitted the development of findings that are used in addressing the problem proposed, do they have utility? And I'd want to check to make sure that I considered both utility and fidelity in the context of the research goals, approach to inquiry, and study characteristics. Methodological integrity. Thank you for joining me. I hope this video will prove to be useful for you as you conduct qualitative reviews.